Okay, hello. I hope you can hear me. I didn't realize there was a waiting room. I apologize. Greg, you should have permissions to do whatever you want, and if you want to introduce yourself and go ahead and get started whenever you're ready.
Okay, well, welcome to Chemical Engineering 101. We're going to talk about organic chemistry, one of my favorite topics when I got my double E degree. Oops, wrong meeting. All right, all right, let me get started. Let me do some sharing. Greetings from California. I'm in Silicon Valley, and let me get that going. Now, I'm going to ask the inevitable question. Can you see my slide?
Yes.
Okay. I see some nodding heads, which means yes, it is. Okay, there we go. All right. Well, first of all, thanks so much for inviting me to present. You guys are the future of ham radio. I'm extremely excited to talk to universities, and I'm really happy that you guys have such a great club and a great organization. And Aiden, thank you. Where are you, Aiden? I can't even see you. Are you that one of those people in the room there?
I'm behind the screen, behind the camera, making sure that the Zoom meeting runs.
Oh, that's okay.
There's my
So,
hand.
oh yes, of course that's your hand. I know that's you. Anyway, all right, greeting from Silicon Valley. Let me get started. So let me ask you guys this, because I know you guys have lots of homework to do later on tonight, or maybe you want to go to a beer bust or something. What is the schedule here? How long can I go? Because I can keep going for 60, 90 minutes. You let me know. It's what, 7 o'clock for you folks? It's only 4 o'clock for me.
Yeah,
How we
it's
doing?
7 o'clock. Let's say hour and a half, somewhere between there.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. Yeah, it typically goes, to be honest, with questions and such, uh hour 15, hour 20. So that's why I said hour to hour and a half. If you want to get through all my good stuff, I'll it goes for about an hour 20. So we'll shoot for that. If for some reason we need to stop sh earlier, let me know. I also love to be very interactive. So if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt me and I'll be happy to answer them. Okay, so let me get started. Let me click on here. Oh, let me turn on my laser pointer. Oh, yeah, you guys love those laser pointers. There we go. All right, there we go. All right, well, first of all, I am Greg Miron. I was born in upstate New York, but I got my double E degree at Case Institute of Technology in Cleveland. I know a lot of you are double E's. And let me tell you, it is one of the best degrees you can get. You can do just about anything with electrical engineering degree. I've been in Silicon Valley for about 45 years with that degree. Worked for some big companies, worked for some startups, had a lot of fun doing the startups. I got to retire a couple of years ago. So let me tell you that degree is going to be worth something for you in the long term. We've got 5 grown kids. I dare say they're probably older than all of you, but they're spread all over the country. I'm very proud of them. They're all happy, healthy, and successful. We got 6 grandkids, but you don't care about those. Uh, I am a bogey golfer. That's one of the things that I like to do in retirement. My one of my sons wanted to get me into golf. He figures that was cliche, so why not do that? So I did that. Really having fun. In fact, I just finished 18 holes this morning or this afternoon, and I'm just fresh off the course, so I'm ready to sit down and relax. I love to do backpacking. I do a lot of hiking. I bring my ICOM 705 with me, and it's a lot of fun. And that's one of the reasons that I thought about portable antennas, but I'll get into that. I am a musician. I do a lot of composing, recording, and if you're ever on Spotify, just look up a nice vibe. That's me. But my geeky passion, and I am a geek, and I'm very proud to be a geek. And in Silicon Valley, that's all we are is geeks, is Parks on the Air. I was not stay in the shack kind of person. I wanted to get outside and play with radios ever since I was a younger kid. Old technology, Radio Shack 5-watt walkie-talkies, played radio outside. I've always loved it. And so as I got older, I got into more of it, of course, with ham radio. Believe it or not, and I see these numbers and I still can't believe them because I started in early 2021. It was COVID that got me into the shack again and into ham radio more actively. Uh, but I'm close to 1,000 POTA activations, which just seems nuts to me. Of which I'm a pure sidebander. I got about 80,000 of those, all on POTA, and I'm an ICOM guy. So what can I say? So that's the preface of my Parks on the Air. You can take notes, but you guys take notes all the time. Don't do it. Everything I'm going to talk about are all in these PDFs. I always do these for free. Each one of my antennas has their own PDF, and this is a persistent link. I update the underlying file, but the link stays the same with my call sign and the name of the antenna. So they're always available. And Aiden, I don't know if you pass those out, but he will if you don't. I think I gave those to you, Aiden. And or you can use these QR codes to get a quick jump on those. But they're always going to be free. And the slides I'm showing tonight for you is a subset, a small subset of my primer, which really gets you into a lot of geeky electrical engineering stuff in case you're interested. Plus, it goes into in depth on all the antennas. So there you go. You can take notes or just sit back and relax. So I am a geek, and I told you that because I got my double E degree. And just like you, I had to get into a lot of math and physics and, a lot of field engineering, field theory. And the field theory was the toughest, but boy, that's the most relevant to ham radio. It really helps you pass your tests, and I think most of you are hams anyway already. But when I think about new antennas, and that's when this all started, when I was starting POTA about 4 or 5 years ago, I looked at some of the commercial antennas and I said, three, four, $500 for a portable antenna? No way. I'm going to figure out how to design my own. So I do want to understand some of the geeky stuff. I want to understand some of the math and physics behind why antennas work so well or not work well. But I just spend about 5% of my development time looking at the theory, the math and physics. Okay. I'm hearing the recording going on and
Sorry, don't know what happened there.
on. Don't worry about it, Aiden. I'm just funning with you. All right. So from the math and physics, I get into the modeling. And this is what I learned to use about, again, 4 or 5 years ago. And believe me, this is old school software. It's not, it's got a very old school UI. It's kind of complicated, but I wanted to learn how to use it. And so I did. And I found by using it, I could model a bunch of ideas that were in my head and see if they really have some potential. And plus, they generate some beautiful pictures, which I'll show you. So I spend about 15% of my development time modeling the antenna before I eventually go into my backyard. And if any of you ever end up in Silicon Valley, we all live on postage stamps. It's a peninsula, so supply and demand. That's why the property prices are so ridiculously high. This is my little house. It's on about a quarter acre, and that's about as big as they get out here in Silicon Valley. But we do have a lot of solar panels. But if you look over here, this backyard, that's my antenna proving guard. That's that ground. That's where I spend about 80% of my development time taking the models that I've figured out inside the house, go into the backyard, build the prototypes out of parts from my ham radio stuff box, and see if it actually works. And then I do a lot of testing to confirm what the model says, because this is the virtual world. My home in the backyard is the real world. Once I get to that point, and if you add those up, that's 100%, then I take the antennas out to the parks. And let me tell you, if you love to design and play with antennas, there's nothing better than getting involved in PODUP because you get some real world activation, evaluation out there when you do an activation. I A-B'd many antennas, ABC'd many antennas, talk to the hunters, which one sounds louder to you, which one seems to have a better propagation in your particular area. So I've loved using PODA, not just for making contacts, virtual contacts with folks all over the world, but also to test out the antennas. And as far as I know, I have about 5,000 people worldwide. And the ham radio community isn't massive, right? We only have about, 100 or 2,000 in the US. But as far as I know, I've got a mailing list of about 5,000 people now. That's probably a fraction of the folks that have shared it with their buddies because I get emails every day from people I've never heard of. So there's quite a few of these out there, and that's the important thing to me. I just want to share the good stuff with other people. Okay, so one of the things when you get into business and you establish some principles or some people call objectives, you got to set up some priorities. You got to set up, in this case, design principles. First and foremost, and when you set these up, you got to make sure they're measurable. When I started Hewlett Packard, that's how I got out to California. Dave Packard used to say, if you can't measure it, you can improve. And that's the same thing with these design principles. If you don't attach a number to it, then you really don't know if you're doing well. So first and foremost, my number one priority when I think about it and designing a new antenna is performance. And how do you measure that? For me, it has to be highly efficient, at least 90% efficient. And when I say efficient, what I'm saying is if you apply QRO 100 watts, you radiate 90 watts. If you apply QRP, 10 watts, you radiate 9 watts. Well, that seems like a no-brainer, but let me tell you, most of the antennas that POTA activators use are somewhere between 30 and 50% efficient. 30 to 50%. So when they put in 100 watts, they're only radiating 30 to 50 watts. Will they get good SWR? Absolutely. Will they make contacts? Absolutely. Can the antenna be much, much, much better? Absolutely. And that's why I got into this. So my first and foremost design principle is based on performance. And because I only do portable antennas, it really requires it to be, I call it elegant. In other words, when you build it, you can make it very complicated and have a lot of parts and pieces, or you can make it as simple as possible, which I learned in years of business here in Silicon Valley, that the simpler the model and ultimately the final product is that performs the function that you want, the better it is. So in this case, with a portable antenna, I wanted an elegant set up and take down solution, 5 minutes or less. I don't want to spend 20, 30 minutes setting up a complicated antenna because I'm outside. I want to make contacts. I want to have some fun. So typically now I can set up my antennas in about 2 minutes. In fact, we're going out tomorrow to one of my favorite parks up in the hills, and we're going to set up one of my favorite antennas, and it's only going to take me 2 minutes to set up, and then I'm on the air. It's fantastic. So performance, elegance, and if it's a portable antenna, convenient. It's got to be easy to pack in your backpack, especially QRP, or a picnic table. That's where most of us do it for Parks on the Air, for QRO activations. And you guys aren't into this, but someday you may live in what they call a restricted neighborhood or HOA. I never expected this. When I first started sharing my antenna with fellow hams, I was thinking just for Parks on the Air or things like that. But turns out about a third of the antennas are being used in restricted neighborhoods where you're not allowed to have an antenna in your backyard. Someday, when you have a house and you want to set up an antenna, you could live in a neighborhood that won't let you do that. So, what they like to do is wait till after dinner. They go outside, deploy the antenna in 5 minutes or less, and bang, they're on the air for a couple, 3 hours, and they take it down before the neighborhood marshal can see it. So, easy to pack, transport, backpack, picnic table, HOA. Keep it nice, simple, light, 5 pounds or less. So high performance, very elegant, and highly convenient. That's whenever I design an antenna, that's what I focus on. Pretty straightforward? Okay, great. I am going to get into a little bit of theory, but this is high level, and I'm only going to give you guys enough so that you understand why I designed the antennas that I do. And given that you are a student audience, I'm sure you're studying a lot of this stuff if you're taking field theory. It was probably my toughest double E course when I was in college. But as I found out later in life, it's very relevant when it comes to antennas. So let me help you understand from a basic, simple perspective what an antenna is, what your transceiver sees when it goes to your antenna. Now, I think most of you probably got your ham radio license, so you know this equation, right? Z, which is impedance, is equal to R, which is the real resistance, plus X, which is reactance, right? And reactance can be inductive or it can be capacitive. And I know if you're engineers, you all know what J is. That's an infamous imaginary number, the square root of -1. We learned to hate that. But in the case of antennas, it does play an important role. But the nice thing is, if you only focus on resonant antennas, which is what I do, reactance is 0. So you never have to worry about the square root of -1. So everything I do is resonant, which means you never need to use a tuner, because in a tuner, you get insertion loss, you get other issues. Please don't use it if you don't have to. So let's focus on resonant antennas. So when the antenna is resonant, it only sees two resistors in series to ground. Two resistors in series to ground. That's all it is. That's what your transceiver sees. Here's your transceiver pumping out 100, 20 watts if you have a G90, 10 watts if you have a QRP radio. It sees a radiation resistance, which is a good resistor. That is your friend. It also sees loss resistance, which is a bad resistor, and that is not your friend. So just like everything in life, you have good you have bad. You have yin, you have yang. It's always there, and you have to deal with both if you're thinking about antennas. The good resistor, that's the total power radiated as electromagnetic waves in all directions. That is productive energy, and that's built in to the type of antenna you're using. For example, if you're using a very common quarter wave vertical, it's about 37 ohms. So your transceiver sees the radiation resistance of a quarter wave antenna of about 37 ohms. If you've got a dipole, a half wave antenna fed at the middle, it's roughly double that, about 70, 72 ohms. So that is good resistance. That's your radiation resistance, okay? The bad resistor that's in series with it includes any kind of losses you have in the conductors, insulators, loading elements, but most importantly, and this is where most of the people that use portable antennas, where they lose all this potential radiated energy, it goes into the ground. It's absorbed into the ground. That's wasted energy. A lot of these folks that use these antennas will dump more than half of their potential radiated power into the ground. And like I said, they'll still make contacts, they'll still be happy, but they could be so much better if they do it the right way. All right, so let's get into radiation efficiency because it involves both those resistors. And there's a nice long, page-long derivation to get to this simple bottom line equation. But I'm not going to go through that. Let's just look at the efficiency equation. You probably know this if you took, well, if you're an extra class for sure. But the efficiency of any antenna is equal to the good resistor, radiation resistance in the numerator, plus the sum of the good resistor and the bad resistor in the denominator times 100%. So looking at this equation, you want to get as close as you can to 100%. Is that possible? No, you'll never get to 100%, but you want to get pretty darn close. So just looking at it, what is the obvious thing you want to do? You want to minimize your radiation, your loss resistance, because you have control over that. The type of antenna you're using, it's already defined. That's your radiation resistance. So you can either increase that if you use a different type of antenna, or more typically, you can minimize loss resistance. That's your wasted energy. Up to that point, any questions? Is that pretty clear? And I assume silence means you understand. Silence and heads going, yes. Okay. Thank you. I just want to make sure. All right. Now, this is the slide that really got me excited about designing my own antennas. Well, not the slide, but the theory behind the slide. I made it into a nice, pretty simple slide. But there was a ton of work by people much smarter than me before me that figured a lot of this stuff out. And one of the guys you may see if you down the road, if you do some reading on ham radio antennas and such, is a guy by the name of John Oppenheimer about 12, 15 years ago. He actually calculated the loss resistance of the number of radials that are on the ground. They call them surface radials or ground radials. Uh, and you can't measure them exactly, but you can measure your feed point resistance. You can calculate the radiation resistance of the type of antenna, and then you can come up with a loss resistance. But he spent weeks doing this many, many times, double checking all of his work. And what he came up with was some very interesting numbers. So I don't know how many of you have actually gone out and used a portable antenna. I doubt you have at this point, but maybe you have. Maybe during the summer you have. But let's just take a typical quarter wave vertical antenna that's ground mounted. In other words, the feed point is within inches off the ground. And you just throw out a couple radials. You throw out one on the ground. You know, these are typically thin 18, 16 gauge wires. You throw it on the ground off the ground side of the feed point. And let's just say you just put out two radials, one north, one south, one east, one west, whatever. Let's say you just have two radials. Well, Oppenheimer calculated that that's 85 ohms loss resistance. So your first reaction is if I told you 85 ohms loss resistance, you're saying, man, I'm running 100 watts. What's 85 ohms? That's nothing, right? Well, plug it into that nice radiation efficiency equation. Remember, that's the numerator. So that's your radiation resistance. That's the good resistor for a quarter wave vertical. It's 37 ohms. Regardless, it's 37 ohms. The denominator is the good plus the bad. Let's put 37 plus 85. You end up with 30% efficiency. So if you go out to a park or any kind of portable deployment and you put out just two radials laying on the ground, you're getting a 30% efficiency. So you put in 100 watts, how much do you radiate? 30. You put in 10 watts QRP, 3 watts. Yeah, you'll make contacts, but you can do so much better. Anyway, he went on and he started calculating four radials, which is probably the most typical for portable park activations, one at each compass point. There's only 37% efficiency, 37 watts being radiated. You'll make contacts, but you can do better. Eight radials, 47%. In fact, it takes 32 radials, which is not portable, my friends, and I think you know that, wires laying on the ground to get at least 70% efficient. Of course, if you go up to 64, you can go into the 80s. These are probably more typical home installations where you just kind of set it up and you don't have to do anything with it after you set it up for the most part. But when you go portable, setting this up and taking this down, that sucks. I mean, I'd never do that. I started with four radials until I really understood the theory behind the antenna. In fact, just to kind of give you a teaser as to why I realized about 5 years ago during COVID, when I was home working from home and also studying on building antennas, I did some my own calculations, my modeling, as well as testing in the backyard. And if you just take two radials and you lift them off the ground, they're called elevated radials, roughly 36 inches or about a meter. The loss resistance is not 85 ohms, it's 4 ohms. Plug that in your equation. What do you get? You get 37 over 41, which is 90%. So why bother with 60 radials on the ground when all you have to do is elevate two radials to get 90% efficiency? You'll radiate 90 watts. And let me tell you, my friends, when I first started doing this about 4 years ago, I would hear from hunters, my God, you're the loudest signal on the band. How much power are you running? Do you have an amplifier? No, I don't. It just sounds louder because I'm radiating 90 watts instead of 30. I'm 3 times the power radiated than a guy who has these two radials on the ground. And all I had to do was lift them up 36 inches. Well, as soon as I had that, that was my epiphany. That's when I said, I've got to create an antenna. And so I eventually did that. But once I learned that, then I started doing further research. And there's another guy by the name of Rudy Severance who published this in ARRL QST magazine. And I think this was the groundbreaking study that really woke up a lot of people to elevated radials. So what he did was he said, all right, let me take the 40-meter band. He happened to pick 7.2 megahertz. And let me measure the field intensity of the power that's being radiated from my antenna, my quarter wave 40-meter antenna with the radials on the ground. And let me measure the field intensity about a wavelength away. And what he did is he started with four radials on the ground and he made that his 0 dB point. In other words, everything is normalized to four radials on the ground. Okay, whatever it was, whatever he measured, that's his 0 dB point. So if you look at this chart, it's pretty straightforward. Your gain improvement of four radials on the ground is shown in dB in the y-axis, and the number of radials that he began to deploy again on the ground is shown in the x-axis. And what he found was going from four radials on the ground on 40 meters, about a wavelength away, the field intensity grew by 6 dB roughly, which is also an S unit on your typical radio. To 64 radials, he got about 6 dB improvement. Imagine putting out 64 radials. Well, that's a lot of work, but he did that. And so he thought, okay, this makes sense because the more radials you put on the ground, the more efficient the ground or the counterpoise or the ground system becomes. It returns a lot of the potential radiated current and sends it back to the feed point to be re-radiated. So that's why, as you increase the number of radials on the ground, it helps your performance. It gets more of that power radiated out of your antenna. Then he said, okay, so I've been reading about all this elevation stuff, so let me do my own experiment. And I read that he did this experiment 5 or 6 times because he couldn't believe it. It worked so well. He said, "Okay, I guess it's true because I ran it several times and I'm getting the same result." What he did now, this is the same y-axis. That's your gain improvement over 4 radials on the ground. Now the x-axis, instead of adding more ground radials, he took those same 4 radials and he started to raise them off the ground. Raise them off the ground or elevate the radials. He found just by elevating, believe me, these are 33-foot long radials. This is not a simple task. That's why I really respect the fact that he went to all this work. When he raised them just 6 inches off the ground, this is in feet, 6 inches off the ground, he got a 5 dB improvement in field intensity about a wavelength away. In fact, when he got him up to 4 feet, he realized 4 radials, 4 feet off the ground on 40 meters is equivalent to 64 radials on the ground. 4 radials elevated up about 4 feet is equivalent to 64 radials on the ground. He was shocked by this, pleasantly shocked. And that's when all this talk about elevating radials really began to take off. And that, of course, really motivated me to design my first antenna. But why does that happen? Why does that happen? Well, it should be somewhat clear. Let's take a look at a typical half-wave antenna. And those of you that got your license probably do remember that if you look at a half-wave antenna like a dipole, uh, you create a standing wave when it's resonant. When it's resonant, a standing wave of both current and voltage that are 90 degrees out of phase. So here's your current distribution in red. Here's your voltage distribution in blue. What you see is your current maximum is at the center of your half-wave antenna. In other words, the bulk of the current, because your resistance is very, very low, and so it's very relatively low. So your voltage is very low, but that's where your greatest current is, right at the feed point. But as you move out to the ends of the antenna, it's like in a half-wave dipole or even a quarter-wave antenna, the current dramatically drops until it's negligible near the end, but your voltage gets very high. So that's why when you have an antenna out in the field and someone's operating, you never touch the ends of the antenna, whether it's a radial on a quarter wave or a half wave antenna, because you have high voltage. It's going to give you a little spark. I think we've all done that. I've done that a couple times, unintentionally, but I've done it. It's not pleasant. But the center of your antenna is your current maxima. Now, this is a half wave antenna. A quarter wave antenna is just taking this left half as an example, bending it up at a 90-degree angle. And so now you have your quarter wave antenna up off the ground here, and you have your radial here. What happens when this radial's on the ground? Well, you've got a lot of current. And remember, it's current that radiates, not voltage. It's current that radiates, not voltage. You have all this current in your radial. The first half, 2/3 of it, you've got a lot of measurable current. For those of you that took physics, and I know you all have, think of a capacitor. You have 2 plates. As you move the plates further away from each other, what happens? The capacitance is inversely proportional to the distance between the plates. So if your radial is on the ground, your radial is one plate of the capacitor, your ground is the other plate of the capacitor. If they're touching or they're pretty darn close, you have very, very high capacitance. That means the radial is capacitively coupled to the ground. That means the ground is sucking up all that current, all that potential radiated energy into the ground. You're just heating up the ground. You're not radiating that energy. As you move this radial up off the ground, the capacitance is inversely proportional to that distance, and so it dramatically goes down. And that's why he found when he raised the radials up to 6 inches, he got 5 dB of more radiated energy out. And then, of course, when you run it as a, let's say, this is a quarter wave. If you run it as a half wave, and I run half wave verticals, I'll talk about those. There's much, much less current near the end of the antenna, For example, off-center fed dipole, roughly 80-20, 80% radiator, 20% counterpoise, or end-fed half wave, 95% radiator, 5% counterpoise. You have much, much less current. So two things can happen. You can not only lower the feed point because your feed point is way down here where there's very little current, so you can get it within a foot of the ground. Never run a end-fed half wave with the less than a foot off the ground because you'll still have some coupling. But also your counterpoise can just droop down and run along the ground because you're not capacitively coupling to the ground because there's very little current. This is probably the most important slide to understand why a quarter wave vertical with elevated radials works so much better than one with ground radials, and eventually why you have a half wave antenna with a counterpoise that can be on the ground. Any questions up to this point? Because now we get into the good stuff. We get into the antennas. Any questions? I assume silence is good.
We have one.
I
I
see
may
a
have to
hand.
repeat it.
I can see a hand. I can't hear him, but I can see
It
a hand.
goes through here.
Okay, I'll come up. You probably can't see me anymore,
I
but
can't.
so a lot of the time when people talk about like counterpoises and radials and ground planes and all that,
Yep.
they say that you're trying to create like a ground plane that
Yep.
reflects the signal upwards, which to my logic would mean like you would want it to be as well coupled to the ground as possible. But this seems to indicate kind of the opposite of that. So like what is the discrepancy
So
there?
yeah, so okay, I can see why you say that. It doesn't. I think using the word reflected, the energy up off the ground is not correct. What it's actually doing is the radiated energy that's in your quarter wave radiator in this case, or half wave, it doesn't make any difference, that is being radiated away from the antenna is going into, some of it goes right directly into your radials. And if the radial is not capacitively coupled to the ground, the current goes back into the radial to the feed point to get re-radiated. But if that radial is on the ground, then the ground will want to absorb all that energy that ordinarily would have gone back to the feed point. Instead, it goes into the ground because it's capacitively coupled. So the bottom line is you do not want your counterpoise to be capacitively coupled to the ground. This is why it's so confusing. People call it a ground plane. You don't want your ground plane to be capacitively coupled to the actual ground, the soil. You want it just to provide something for the antenna to push its current, radiated current against, to be sent back to the feed point and to be re-radiated. I tried to make that as simple. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, yeah. So the problem is ground plane and ground, people consider them the same thing. They're very, very different. The ground plane, that's why we like to say counterpoise or radiator or radial versus ground or soil. You don't want the potential radiated energy to go into the soil if your radial or and if your radial and a quarter wave vertical is on the ground. It doesn't go back to the feed point to get re-radiated. It goes into the ground because it's coupled, capacitively coupled to the ground, because the plates of the two capacitor are basically touching. Good?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. Just want to make sure. All right, that's enough of the theory stuff. I want to get into the fun stuff. These are the antennas. So one of the things I learned in addition to coming up with design objectives and here in the Valley is that, you come up with fun names for all your products. And so I did the same thing here for my antennas. Again, these are all homebrew designed antennas with detailed 15 to 20 page PDFs with pictures, parts, links to where you can get the parts if you don't have them. So I came up with names. The first one, my quarter wave vertical with two elevated radials, I call the Performer. PER, portable, elevated, resonant. Silly, but it works. It's a portable, elevated, and resonant quarter wave antenna, which covers 40 to 6 meters. That's either sits on a PVC with a ground spike or a tripod. Most people deploy it this way. I prefer the PVC tube. Either way, they both work. with two elevated tuned linked radials. Now, when I say two elevated tuned linked radials, elevated obviously means they're up off the ground, like you can see here with these two yellow wires. I hope you can see that on your big screen. Uh, Tuned means once you raise radials off the ground, they have to be tuned to the band. They're typically shorter than a quarter wave, but they're the other half of the antenna, so they have to be tuned to the band you're on. And because, as you know, in frequency, the longer or the lower, let's put it this way, the lower the frequency is, the longer your antenna has to be, right? You know that. Therefore, if you want to cover 40 meters, 20 meters, 17, 15, 12, 10, and 6 meters, you've got to have an adjustable radiator, which is a telescoping whip, and you also have to have adjustable radials. And what I use spade connectors, what have you. You can use whatever you want, but it increments the length of the radial for whatever band you're on. You adjust the whip, that's easy. But then you'll see in a couple slides, I adjust the length of the radial to that particular band. So they're tuned to the band, they're linked with spade connectors, and they're above the ground. And what I found is in most cases, if you want to go omnidirectional, you put them opposite each other. Doesn't make any difference. You put it north, south, east, west, it's still omnidirectional. But if you want to get a little bit of incremental gain and some front to back, and I analyzed this in the model many, many different degrees, but I found an optimal point. If they're 90 degrees apart, you'll get some modest directivity between the span of the radials, and you'll get about a 3 dB front to back. And for those of you that know dB, when I say 3 dB, half the power, or let's put it this way, double the power goes out the front of the antenna versus the back of the antenna. So you have, in essence, like a directional vertical that's highly efficient. All right. Like I said, I computer modeled this. I computer modeled everything from the height of the feed point to the height of the radials to their compass points, what have you. The bottom line is that's what the performer antenna ended up to be. Very lightweight, very easy to deploy. And like I said, thousands of people now have adapted this antenna, and I'm very humbled by the fact that they really like it. I designed it for myself when I first started doing POTA 4 or 5 years ago. It worked so well, word spread, and now it is what it is. So what's a nice, simple little picture? All right. Telescoping whip. I don't know if you guys have a lot of these parts, but the most common telescoping whip for ham radio guys is 17 feet. Because if it's 17 feet, you can run 20 meters quarter wave without a coil. And you never want to use a coil or inductor because that provides insertion loss. You always want to have a straight radiator, in this case, a telescoping whip. So this telescoping whip gives you 20 meters to 6 meters. And for 40 meters, I do add a coil at the bottom to get that, but that's only for 40 meters. And that's okay because 40 meters is more of a regional band anyway. But remember I said, let's say you want to go on 6 meters. Well, you have something that's roughly about 50, 60 inches long. And so you kind of know where to put your radiator for 6 meters. And as it turns out, the computer model and my field testing found that it's roughly about, you need 43-inch elevated radials to resonate on the 6 meter band. If you want to go to 10 meters, it's that same length plus another 37 inches, roughly 80 inches. So that's your incremental segment, right? This is 6 meters to here. Then if you want to go on 10 meters, add another 37 inches. If you want to go on 12 meters, another 16, all the way up to 20 meters, you want to add it all the way out. So that's this whole linked radial is good for 20 meters, and you have a duplicate that's either 180 degrees apart for omnidirectional or 90 degrees apart for some directivity. So two elevated tuned radials in this case are 90 degrees apart. The computer model and my field testing set these up, these lengths in the radial line, to be at the center of each of the bands, the center of each of the bands. So it covers CW, it covers digital, it covers sideband. If you want to go, let's say CW, digital, you lengthen the telescoping whip just a little bit because it's lower in frequency. If you want to go sideband, typically in the upper side of the band, you shorten it. but each of these have been tuned to the center of the band. So you never have to worry about these numbers. And in the PDF, I show you how to cut them all to these particular segments. All you have to do is adjust your whip. Now, let's say you're on 20 meters and all of a sudden you realize, my gosh, the radiation or the propagation on 10 meters is wide open globally, worldwide. I want to get on 10-meter band. So what do? Well, to change bands on the radials, there's a hard way and an easy way. They both work. I recommend the easy way, but I started out when I first designed and deployed this antenna the hard way. Then I had an epiphany and realized I could make it much easier. But let's say you're on 20 meters, you want to go to 10. What do you have to do? Well, of course, you have to shorten your radiator because you're going from 20-meter band, 14 megahertz, to the 10-meter band, 28 megahertz. So you have to shorten it quite a bit. But then you have to get rid of all these other segments, right? You don't need all these incremental segments out for 20 meters. So the hard way to do it, to change your radials, is you take in this case, a spade connector. That's what I used. You can use whatever you want. Unhook this whole radial string here, and then reclip it. So you just have your 10-meter radiator, and then you have two elevated radials up to this point, which are then clipped to these fiberglass stakes. And these have to be non-conductive. And they're about 36 inches off the ground. The feed point's roughly 4 to 5 feet off the ground. You want to keep it off the ground because remember, this is your current maxima, right? This is your current maxima. So the hard way would be to unhook each of these strings, rehook them up, move the stakes in to accommodate that, and then you're set for the next band. And I did it that way for about 6 months in the field. And then one day it hit me. I said, there's got to be an easy way. I'm tired of moving these stakes back and forth. Well, then I said, oh my gosh. And this is the way, fellas, that most problems are solved. The simplest answer is always the best answer. We always as engineers, we like to look at things very complicatedly, but in the end, sometimes there's a real simple solution. So I thought to myself, how do I interrupt this radial line so that the antenna does not see the rest of these segments? Oh, yeah, of course. All I have to do is create two new segments and out of non-conductive material. I use paracord. I put spade connectors on them. A lot of guys use that weed whacker string, the fiberglass string. I don't care what you use, about 2 to 4 inches. And I typically store them right here at the end of the radial line. So if I was on 20 meters, it would work perfectly. If I want to jump to 10 meters, I take each of these, there's one on each radial line, I unplug them from the end, and I insert them between the 10-meter and the 12-meter segment. So in the end, the antenna only sees the 6 and the 10, the first 80 inches, and then it says, oh, yeah, this is non-conductive. That's the end of the radial line. It doesn't see the rest of these. So you can leave your fiberglass stakes right where they are, and all you have to do is keep moving these things between the band segments that you want. This takes me about 30, 40 seconds tops, because I know basically where I need to put my 17-foot telescoping whip for the band I'm on, and then I just take these segments and I move them up in between that on each radial, and it's done. It's fantastic. It's fast. It's easy. That's the easy way. That's the way I recommend you do it. Now, it comes in two flavors. So you can either deploy it on a tripod. This is the way a lot of people do. It works great. It's probably the most common way to do it. If you look in this particular case, I mentioned here's your telescoping whip. Here's a little mirror mount which attaches to the tripod upper tube. Notice on every quarter wave antenna and every half wave antenna, I have a choke. You have to choke off the feed line, because if you don't put a choke at the feed point, then your feed line, the outer shield of your coax, becomes like a third radial. And it also generates what they call common mode currents, or even worse, RFI, back at the end of the coax, which just happens to be where your radio is. And you get a lot of interference. So always, always, always put a choke on your quarter wave or even half wave antenna at the feed point. Now you see I have they call these things Muller clips, alligator clips, whatever you want to call it. I have the two radial strings come together at that particular Muller clip. You see I have it attached to the ground. This is the you can't see it probably on the big screen, but there's like a little nylon washer in there that insulates the radiator from the ground here. But the ground then becomes these two radial lines. And at the end of those radial lines, for example, if I want to be on 20 meters, this is where I store my 4-inch paracord at the end. And now it's running on 20 meters. The alternative, and I like this one a little better. And again, this is my backyard in California. Uh, you can see I have it's a furniture grade PVC tube. A lot of guys just use the irrigation type with the blue writing on it. I'm kind of a geek, and so I like a nice clean PVC tube, but it also has thicker walls because it's furniture grade, so it's stronger. I just put it on a chameleon spike or what they call a mini tripod, megapod from Wolf River Coil. Either way, depends on what ground you're on. Uh, this PVC tube, I have two end caps that are flat. I just put in a 3/8 by 24 bolt, which then screws into the spike or the small tripod. At the top, I have a coupling nut, and with the coupling nut, then I have a small threaded aluminum rod, or I clip on my mirror mount, and there's a coupling nut that will accept the radiator. Here's the choke, and this is the way I store it. So when I go out to the field, I just put in the spike or the mini tripod, screw this on, put on my coax, put in the radiator, the two radials, and I'm done. I do that in about 2 minutes. It's that fast. The other reason I like this is because I found that when you've got short elevated radials, let's say for 6 meters and really 10 meters, there's a little bit of interaction between the elevated radial, and the metal tripod. A little bit. The only thing you sacrifice is that this even lower SWR. It's still extremely usable that way, but if you're kind of a geek and you want really low SWR, use a PVC tube. Either way, it works. I then cut all my radial strings. You see I have them labeled because you got to keep them labeled so you know which is which. You got to put them in order. There's a company called Wirefy on Amazon. I use their spade connectors because not only do they have heat shrink tubing, but internal glue. In fact, the same spade connectors I put into the field 4 years ago are still in use on my antenna after close to 1,000 activations. So that's why I recommend that brand. I mentioned the non-conductive segments to be inserted. I put all the incremental band segments into a roll with a piece of Velcro. You can see here the two ends with two Muller clips, and here's where they come together with a single. Or you can put them on a kite winder. You get that for a buck on Amazon. And you wind it around that. You buy this clear plastic toiletry bag for a couple bucks on Amazon. I throw in my radial strings. I throw in an antenna analyzer. I really love the Rig Expert. That's my favorite because it's small and it's highly accurate. I bring in a multi-purpose tool like Byberry. And this is the Chameleon M coil, which is what I use for 40 meters on the Performer. I strongly recommend that. All of that fits in this small little bag and keeps it very, very portable. I also have a backpack version because I love to backpack. I know a lot of you folks do too. I love to get out there and hike, enjoy the beautiful scenery, get some exercise, and then play some radio. What I did is I created a backpackable version, a slightly smaller in diameter PVC tube, slightly smaller by about a foot. Normally, you buy these are typically 4 feet. I just cut them down to 3 feet, just so it's more backpackable. There's the whip. There's the spike in this case. You can see I still have the coupling nut here and the bolt at the bottom. Put them together. That little toiletry bag you saw fits right into my ICOM 705 backpack with everything I need. And there it is. I put that on my back. It's extremely light. It's very convenient, very fast to deploy, and I go up wherever I want, and I make amazing contacts. QRP. So the ICOM 705, my favorite portable radio, 10 watts when you use an external battery, but I know I'm radiating 9 watts, and believe me, there's a big difference between radiating 9 watts QRP and 3 watts QRP. A big difference. All right. So in the PDF, there's all the computer model numbers. I won't go over them now, but the bottom line, this is the average across all the bands. The efficiency is over 90%. The SWR is extremely low. You understand SWR, 1 point something to 1. The lower the number, the better, obviously, because that determines how much power is being reflected. The average is 1.02. Reflection coefficient, the smaller this number, the better. Anything under -20 is fantastic. This is -44. The gain, if you put your radials 90 degrees apart, the gain is about 0.41 dBi, so positive dBi gain. Believe me, a typical vertical omnidirectional is about minus minus 0.7, minus 0.8, somewhere around there. So you're getting some positive gain between the span of the radials, but you're also getting a front to back. The power that goes out the front between the span of the radials is 3 dB, which means twice the energy. 3 dB is doubling. Twice the energy goes out the front versus the back. Then there's something called peak radiation angle, which is the takeoff angle that your signal goes. The lower, the better. The lower gives you kind of more DX, let's put it that way. 24 degrees is great for like regional coverage across the US. That's why this antenna is so popular for parks on the air. And something called beam width is how concentrated that beam is relative to its maximum peak radiation angle at 24 degrees. Happens to be 44 degrees, which means the smaller the number, this number is, the more concentrated the signal is at that takeoff angle. Okay, that's all in the PDF, so I won't go over it in a lot of detail now, but that's there. This is what the model produces. And the model produces things like, your standard SWR reflection coefficient. It also produces these beautiful line charts of what the radiation looks like. Here's the antenna, what the radiation looks like off the antenna from the side as well as from the top. But this is my favorite part. I go nuts over this. This is the 3D, what they call 3D. It's still kind of 2D. It's old school, let's put it that way, but it's still pretty cool. The actual purple and the red indicates the highest current energy that's being radiated from the antenna. And you can see, if you look carefully, especially there in the big room, it may not be easy to see, but you see one radial here and one elevated radial here at 90 degrees. You can see the bulk of the energy that's being radiated from the antenna is between the span of those radials. But look at the side chart. I think this is way cool. When I first designed this and I saw this, I go, oh, I got to try this. I want to see if this really works. And sure enough, in the field and based on my field tests, that's exactly the way it works. It's amazing. So not only do you get all this radiation up here, but you get some radiation up here, which gives you high angle radiation for close-in contacts. And even a little bit up here, which helps you, like in California, I can work Nevada, one state away. It's pretty cool. But here's the real world. That's just the virtual world. This is the real world. Those of you that understand SWR curves, I hope you do. And if you do, this is pretty impressive. Here, each of the bands it operates on, 20s, 17, 15, all the way up to 6. The lower the number, the better. Obviously, I'm a sidebander, so I kind of have these resonating in the sideband region. But if you look at this antenna, the entire 20-meter band from about 14 megahertz all the way up to 14,350, the whole thing is under 1.5, really 1.4 to 1 and below. Why is that important? If you've got an SWR, if you've measured antennas with SWR before and you get a 1.5, your efficiency is 96%. In other words, only 4% of the energy is being reflected back to the source. That efficiency is higher than most of the portable antennas out there, especially at 30 and 50% efficient antennas. So my recommendation is never use a tuner, whether it's a manual tuner or automatic antenna tuner. You don't need one if your SWR is under 1.5 to 1 or less. So you do need a tuner here? No. In fact, you can operate all the way down here without even touching the antenna on your CW and digital all the way on up here to sideband. This is the 20-meter band. This is the most popular band. Here's a 17-meter band, very flat. 15-meter band. What is that? That's a 4 megahertz band. The entire band is 1.2 to 1 or lower. Incredibly efficient. You're talking 99.2%. Only 0.8% of the power is being reflected back to the source. 12-meter band, extremely flat. 10-meter band using the tripod, still 1.2, in this case on the sideband. If you use the PVC tube instead, you won't get this interaction. It's closer to like 1.05, 0.05 to 1 roughly. But either way, you don't need a tuner. It's beautiful. In fact, you can operate anywhere on the 10-meter band. And here's your 6-meter, very big 4 megahertz band, where you can see tuned to the center of the band. 2/3 of the band is 1.5 to 1 to better. That's the real world, fellas. That's why this antenna works so well. Once you set it up, you're done. You don't have to worry too much about it. Let's get even geekier. Let's take a look at the radials when they're 90 degrees apart with some directivity versus 180 degrees apart for omnidirectional. Now, I live on the West Coast. So I put my radials, my 2 elevated radials, one kind of northeast and one kind of southeast, so I can work the rest of the U.S. From the west. A lot of guys in the center of the country will put that omnidirectional, or they can decide if they want to go west or go east, depending on the time of day. But what does it look like? Here's the difference. This is looking at, the model shows you what it looks like from the side, whether you're opposite, 2 radials 180 degrees apart in blue or 90 in red. Let's zoom in on that. Let's fully understand that. Remember, I said the takeoff angle, that's the peak radiation going out the front of the antenna in this case, is 24 degrees off the horizon. This is on the 15-meter band, just to take an example. You get a 0.31 dBi, positive energy, positive dBi going out the front of the antenna when they're directional. When you put it omnidirectional, all omnidirectional antennas look pretty much like this blue line here, but this actually performs pretty well. It's a minus 0.67 dBi, so you get about a dB more at the peak, at the angle of peak radiation or the takeoff angle. But if you want to work, let's say from West Virginia, the eastern half of the country, a lot of that, you don't need a low angle of radiation. That's more for getting to me in California, or maybe even getting some DX in Europe. You want regional coverage. That is between 30 and 60 degrees off the horizon. Look at all the extra incremental energy you get when your radials are at 90 degrees versus omnidirectional at 180 degrees. You get extra energy here to make more contacts. And if you want to work really close, and this is about maybe 400 to 1,500 miles away. If you want to work maybe 200 to 400 miles away, they call it NVIS, near incident vertical skywave. You see all this extra energy you get when your radials are there versus when they're omnidirectional. So you get all this extra power to work more regional and NVIS coverage, if as opposed to a traditional, or in this case, even the performer in this omnidirectional format. So it depends on what you want to do. Both situations work. It depends on what your objective is in terms of your radio communications. All right, let me stop there. This is the performer quarter wave. I'm going to get into the half wave next, but let me stop there and let me ask, are there any questions about the performer, elevated, radial, quarter wave antenna?
Yes, hang on.
I see. Is that the same guy?
No.
No, it's different. Hello.
Oh, good. Okay, good. He's
so-
waving at the screen. No, I'm over here. Okay.
He's here.
Uh-oh.
I see his arm. Yeah, there it is.
So I had a question. So
Yes, sir.
even if you like electrically disconnected your radials, would you still have some interference from like the other segments that were not like connected coupling?
Even if you disconnected?
Yes. Would you still have some like interference from them acting as like separate antennas from like coupling?
No. No, you mean using my non-conductive segment?
Yeah. Like
Yeah,
if you
yeah.
still had like the conductive segment like hanging out there though, would that cause like unwanted interference?
No. In fact, that's a good question. I think if I understand your question right, tell me if I didn't. But that was one of my concerns. That's why I never ran it with that. I didn't think of using that non-conductive segment because I was afraid that the rest of the segments that I'm not using for that particular band would interfere with this quarter wave antenna. And I tried modeling that, and I modeled it with a non-conductive segment, and the model said, nope, there's no interference. You don't have to worry about it. In essence, that's what it said. So then I said, all right, I don't believe it. I would go out in my backyard and I ran test after test, and I looked at running the antenna both ways with, without the non-conductive segment, just the short, like say for 10 meters, this is short 80-inch wires with the stakes pulled up. And I compared it to inserting the segment and then adding the rest of the radial line in there. I I worked with some hunters from my backyard. They weren't POTA people, but from some people that I had set up to work with. And I said, "Do you hear any difference? Am I losing potential radiated energy? Because my model says I'm not, and I can't seem to measure any difference here in my backyard. What about you? What do you hear?" No difference. No difference. So the model was right, and my testing worked out right. So my little 4-inch non-conductive segment uh, works perfectly because the antenna really doesn't see the rest of the radial line that's out there because it stops and it says, okay, that's all I need to know. I'm just going to use these two radials and I'm done. That's all I need because the rest of it really doesn't resonate with the antenna because at that particular frequency, it only needs to see the first 80 inches and that's it. I tried to simplify the answer. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. Thank you.
That's a great question. There's another question. I see a hand raised. I see a little hand up in the corner of, how do you say your name? Hasith?
Yeah, you got it.
Yeah, I know.
I do have two questions.
Yes, sir.
One,
Oh, I can tell. These are going to be good questions.
well, I don't know about that. One, have you ever tested the two radials on smaller angles, like 45 degrees or anything like that? And does that improve like your directionality or anything like that significantly?
So let me tell you, that's a great question. Because when I first modeled this, I didn't even think about putting the radials less than 180 degrees. When I first modeled it, Hasith, I put them opposite each other and because I wanted an elevated radial omnidirectional antenna. And then, of course, you're sitting down, you're having a couple sips of beer, and you're getting ready for dinner and you're thinking, let me just try some different things. And I love being creative. I love, like I said, I'm a geek. I took things apart when I was a kid, like probably most of you guys did. I said, let me just vary some things here in the model and see what happens. Well, I was shocked when I said, what happens if I put the radials instead of opposite each other? I just happen to put it by accident 160 degrees, let's say, because you're not precise in the field. I noticed, wait, there's a little bit of radiation favoring the span that's 160 degrees versus 200 degrees. And then I said, all right, let me keep playing with the angle between the radials, see what makes a difference. The bottom line is because I went all the way from 20 degrees apart thinking, oh, that's going to be a super cool antenna with 20 degrees radials apart. The problem is the closer you get together, they start to interfere with each other. And as they interfere, they create some disruption in the radiation. And as you create disruption in the radiation, not only do you lower efficiency, but your propagation, your radiation pattern gets all messed up. The bottom line is 90 degrees after trying every single by 10 degrees, 120, 110, 100, 90, all the way down to 20 degrees, even 10 degrees, the optimal distance turned out to be 90 degrees or two compass points next to each other. And so I tested all that on the model and I even played around in the field and it proved to be correct once again. So the model was right. The darn thing is always right.
Yeah, that's great. I do have another question.
Yes,
Also,
sir.
we recently got a 17-inch whip for the club, so we have one
Hmm.
that we can mess around with as well.
Excellent.
So now, when we are deploying in a port activation, especially, say you
Yep.
have trees or other conductive elements, right? Trees, I'm assuming my assumption was that, oh, trees are like you have nine, I don't know how many percent water,
Yep.
and let's say that you're deploying a directional antenna and it's the only possibility is that you have to be next to a tree. Now, would that impact your deployments, or would you like ideally, yes, if you can find a backyard or something without trees, that would be good. But any comments on that?
I got to say, you guys ask the best questions compared to the old guys at the ham clubs. You guys are asking great questions. I always found that when it comes to antennas, now when you model things, it's in the virtual world, right? That's not real. But it gives you a place to start from, right? That's true with any kind of model, whether it's a business model, financial model, electronics model, or in this case, an antenna model. It gives you a place to start from. The real world has a lot of other things. And when it comes to antennas, and I heard this said, my dad used to tell me this because he was a big CWer, ham radio guy. And I heard it said many, many times since. When it comes to antennas, everything affects everything. And so in the real world, the two biggest components that affect the antenna are the ground, the type of soil you're on. And I'm in California, so I've got very fertile soil. Now, I don't know whereabouts you guys operate in West Virginia, but maybe you have rockier soil. So the conductivity of the soil is different from place to place. Also, near field surroundings will have an impact. Less so the trees, more so some really hard surface objects because you get reflections and re-reflections and all those kinds of things. So what I say in my PDFs, I always say the same thing. I said, in a traditional flat area with reasonably fertile soil, this is where I get my resonance with my telescoping whip. But if you've got different kinds of soil and you have near field surroundings, yeah, somewhat trees aren't as bad as at these frequencies. Trees really don't have an impact. If you're running VHF, UHF, the high frequency stuff, trees and the water components within the trees will have an effect. You want to keep your UHF, VHF antennas away from trees if you possibly can. But HF, these lower frequencies, it typically goes right through the trees. That's not a problem. But there are many things in near field surroundings like houses with metal parts, wires, LED lights, solar panels, they all affect your antenna. But it won't necessarily affect your efficiency. It may alter the radiation pattern just a bit. It may alter your resonance just a bit. But the nice thing about the Performer, and I've taken it to many different parks, some very, very rocky, some very in woodsy, especially when I go backpacking, some very, very flat and open, like when I go to a picnic table in a big wide open park here in Silicon Valley. Uh, I my resonance does change a little bit, but that's easily compensated for by adjusting the whip slightly. And that's why I say memorize how many sections of your new 17-foot whip that you got roughly where you want to be for that particular band. I know, for example, if I use my Chameleon 17-foot whip, I don't know which one you have. I know for 10 meters, I want to pull out 5 sections. For 12 to start. For 12 meters, I pull out 6 sections. For 15, I pull out 7, roughly. But that's where I start. But depending on where I am, the soil conditions and the near field surroundings, I just use my little rig expert to kind of tune into the resonance I want to be at. Because I'm a sideband guy, I go towards the upper part of the band. So that's a very good question. But for this type of antenna at these frequencies, you don't need to worry too much about it because you've got an adjustable radiator, a telescoping whip, which can compensate for it easily to get the right resonance you want. Does that make sense, Seth?
Yep. Thank you so much.
Sure. Any more questions in that massive conference room down there, or auditorium, I should say? No. Okay. All right. So let's see. It's 10 after 8 for your time. Can I go another 20, 25 minutes? Is that okay?
Sure. Looks like we have one more question too on
Oh,
your
well, maybe
Performer,
we'll go
so-
another hour. Go ahead.
Yeah,
No, I
just,
love questions, so I appreciate it. Go ahead.
Real quick, so looking at the SWR charts, I believe on 15 you had a higher higher SWR and you said that was because of the tripod. Or I'm sorry, that's on 10.
You mean 10,
Yes.
10 and 6. Yep.
Yep. So if it's that susceptible to having a metal tripod, if we go to a park and set up in a pavilion or at a metal picnic table, is that going to affect it significantly?
No, no. Remember, your tripod is within inches of your two elevated radials. And, and I probably shouldn't have said that because I don't want you to freak out. The difference between 1.2 to 1 SWR and 1.05 to 1, look at this. You're talking tenths of a percentage, right? It doesn't make any difference. So that's why if it's more convenient for you guys to use a tripod, use a tripod. Use a tripod. You don't need to worry about it. It doesn't make that much of a difference. It's just a little bit of air. Now I didn't run the equations on it, but I'm assuming there's just a little bit of interference, but not much. I mean, that's negligible.
Cool. Thank you.
Oh, sure. Another good question. Any more? I can keep going. Remember, it's only 5:10 here in California. I can hang out for another 2 hours, but I'd want you to because you guys got studying to do. All right. let's go to the half wave antennas. And I love quarter wave. I love quarter wave elevated radials, but I really love half wave antennas. And I'll tell you why in just a moment. Now, in California, they don't allow wires and trees. I don't know what it's like out in West Virginia. So all of my antennas involve a tripod or a backpack and a telescoping whip. And I love a telescoping whip because it's infinitely adjustable. So you can tune it exactly where you want to be on the band for the optimal SWR. Because these are all set, again, to be highly resonant, highly efficient antennas. So all you have to do is tune it to the operating frequency that you want to be at. So now let's take a look at half wave antennas. And I've got two different versions, and I got a backpack version, of course, as well, because I love to backpack. Now let's go back to a little bit of geeky stuff. This is the same. You saw this chart at the beginning. Here's the number of radials. Here's the ground loss. This is all the same. Here's the efficiency, right? Two radials, 85%, 85 ohms or 30% efficient. But I added two more columns to it. I added a half wave off center fed, OCF, off center fed, and a half wave end fed, EF end fed, okay? The feed point or the radiation resistance, remember the radiation resistance is your good resistor. That's your friend. On a quarter wave antenna, it's about 37 ohms at the feed point. On a half wave antenna, if you feed it in the middle, right, like a dipole, it's about 72 ohms, roughly double that, 70, 72 ohms. But as you move it further on down the half wave radiator line, let's say it's an off-center fed. Remember I said that's roughly 80-20. In other words, instead of being 50-50 on the antenna, it's now more 80-20. So it's off-center fed. You're in the hundreds of ohms of radiation resistance. Or if you're very near the end, you're in the thousands of ohms. And this is just a mathematical exercise. This is not reality, all right? But I want to make a point. Here's the point. Let's say you have one radial. In fact, there are a lot of quarter waves that use one radial on the ground. They think it's cool, it's simple, it's easy. It's very inefficient. It works, but you're only, radiating 26 watts out of 100. But let's just say it's 104 ohms. Let's just pretend a counterpoise, because remember, the reason that this has got so much loss resistance is because you have current in your quarter wave radial that you don't have in your half wave counterpoise, because you're further on down the line, right? Because the current's maximum at the center and it drops off rapidly as you get to the end. But let's just pretend, for the sake of argument, that your counterpoise was the same 104 ohms that it would be a radial on the ground. And that's why I highlighted mathematical exercise only. Remember our original equation? You have radiation resistance and loss resistance. I said you can either do one of two things. You can increase the radiation resistance or decrease the loss resistance, or do both. The point of this exercise is to say, as you increase the radiation resistance to a half wave antenna, the loss resistance becomes very negligible. It's a simple little math equation, right? Here's 37 over the original 37 plus 104, 26%. That's this number. Let's apply that to, let's call it 200 ohms. You're using a 4-to-1 on an off-center fed, 4-to-1 on a 4-to-1 on an off-center fed antenna. You can see it's 66%, assuming it's the same loss resistance, which is not, but let's assume it is. Or if you're used at the end fed, let's say typically 2450, it's 96%. The point of this is we've increased the radiation resistance. We held the loss resistance constant, but we increased the radiation resistance. And that is the way to get very high efficiency on a half wave antenna. But here's the reality. Here's the reality. Is a counterpoise on the ground or drooping down to the ground from your feed point on a half wave, does it have a lot of current in it? No, it does not. Therefore, the loss resistance, and I've measured this directly, field testing in my backyard and then also in Poda Park, a single counterpoise wire drooping down from the feed point, and I typically run these, if you're on a tripod, about 3 feet up. If I'm on my portable version, about 2 feet up, 12 to 25 ohms. 12 to 25 ohms. So when you plug those numbers in here, this radiation efficiency goes way, way up. And that's one of the reasons I love half wave antennas. Let's take a look. So I've got two versions. I have an off-center fed and I have a end fed. Off-center fed uses a 4-to-1 unun. You understand unun? The difference between an unun and a balun? Does everyone know the difference between an unun and a balun? I can't see any heads there in the big room, but unun means unbalanced feed line coax to unbalanced antenna. A balanced antenna is a dipole fed in the middle. But if you move the feed point away from the middle, it becomes unbalanced. So unbalanced feed line, unbalanced antenna. If you have a dipole where it's balanced antenna, you use a balun, balanced antenna, unbalanced feed line. Okay, pretty straightforward, I hope. I built these two antennas using a 4-to-1 or a 49-to-1. You can see this particular tripod, which I love, folds up really small and light. This is the entire antenna system. I pre-mount the mirror mount to the tripod upper pole, extension pole, and I mount the unun, whether it's a 4-to-1 or a 49-to-1, to the mirror mount with a little pigtail that goes to the base of the whip. So it's all set. It's all set to be set up in the field, deployed by putting on the whip, throwing out the counterpoise, and attaching your coax. And again, remember my design principle, top priority, high efficiency. Both of these antennas are well over 90% efficient, so they work great in the field. The simplified picture of the antenna, here's the 4-to-1 unun. This is the off-center fed. And again, I come up with names, right? I came up with this name because I was trying to think of a name and I was at a stoplight. I turned to my left and I saw a Dodge Challenger. I love those cars. A Dodge Challenger. And I said, ooh, that's a good name for an antenna. So that's where that came from. The Dodge Challenger gave me the inspiration for my off-center fed, which is again that same. Now to get all the bands in a half-wave antenna, you've got a longer radiator, so your 17-foot whip won't get you all the bands. But if you've got that chameleon 25-foot, you can work all the way down to 20 meters half-wave with an off-center fed antenna. If you have the 17-foot, I believe you can get 10, 12, and 15 meters. I think I have that later on in the presentation, but it still works. It's just you can't get all the lower bands. But it's the same thing. Here's the telescoping whip, your radiator. Here's the mirror mount. This is isolated from your mirror mount. This is attached to your tripod. You've got a pigtail. I use a little ring terminal at the end of a 12-inch wire, which also becomes part of your radiator. So your radiator is this wire plus this whole big telescoping whip. Again, very little current here, so you don't have to worry too much about it. And then I also have a little pigtail off the ground side of the unun, from which I attach my linked counterpoise, which I'll show you in just a moment. And again, just like the quarter wave, always, always, always use an RF choke, because if you don't, your coax becomes a second counterpoise, which not only screws up your resonance, it also screws up your radiation pattern, and it also generates common mode currents and RFI at your radio. You don't want that. This is your off-center fed Challenger. End fed with a lower angle of radiation for DX, and that's where the name Dominator came from, global domination, silly, but that's what I called it. You use a 49-to-1 transformer in this case because it's an end fed, and it's the same diagram except you just replace this with, in this case, a 49-to-1 transformer. Or 56-to-1, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. Again, because you're at the end, closer to the end of the radiator, even with a 25-foot whip, even with a 25-foot chameleon whip, you can't get 20 meters. It's just too long. So you can get 17 to 10 meters. But this is where the bulk of the DX is, especially here near the top of the cycle. This is the 11-year cycle. So enjoy it now because 10, 12, and 15 meters are going to be going away over the next 3-4 years. They'll come back, but you have to wait 11 years. You only can get 17 to 10. And when you use a 49-to-1 or a 56-to-1, you'll never get 6 meters. But, that band isn't used that much anyway. Okay? In my PDF, I have this all modeled and then calculated and tested in the field. I tell you exactly what the incremental segments are for each of the bands, again, using spade connectors. If you want to work on the 10-meter band, you only attach these two. If you want to work on the 12, then you put the 12-meter segment on. Or you can do the same thing with the Performer. Just insert your non-conductive segment between the 10 meter and 12 meter segment that's in your counterpoise. Remember, it's only one. It's not two. It's one counterpoise. And it still works. Your antenna only sees the first two segments. Then it sees the non-conductive segment and it stops right there. Okay, so that's the Challenger. That's the off-center fed. There's a Dominator, the end fed. Again, if you look in these pictures, you can see the way I have it deployed. Here's the telescoping whip. Here's the mirror mount. Here's that 12-inch pigtail, which goes to the positive side of your unun. Then I have another little 6-inch pigtail, which is ready to accept your counterpoise wire on the negative side. Same thing with the 49-to-1 on the positive and also the negative. The advantage of these antennas is you can see I already have the mirror mount attached to the tripod. I already have the unun, and this is also an unun, whether it's a 4-to-1 or 49-to-1, already attached to the mirror mount using like a little using one of the screws and a spacer. It's already attached, so it's ready to go when you get out into the field. It's very, very fast to deploy, even faster than the Performer. But here's where I get geeky, and I know you guys, I can tell you guys are going to like this. So the components. Again, structurally, these antennas are very, very efficient, but what limits your efficiency are the components you use to match the impedance. So LDG is a very common 4-to-1. A lot of guys, because they're cheap, only 30 bucks. It has low insertion loss, and I use my Nano VNA back to back to test these repeatedly, so I know these are exactly right. It has a very low insertion loss, about 92% efficiency, so that's good. That's pretty darn good. Rated for 200 watts. It only goes up to 30 megahertz. I have run it on 6. It works okay. Not great, but it works okay. And then you have to have a choke. If you guys start playing with components, there are two companies in particular. Well, I like Chameleon too, so 3. But the 2 in particular I love. One is called Palomar Engineers. They're down here in San Diego, south of me, but they're in San Diego. They make what they call a coax wrapped toroid. This is how a lot of hams build their own. You can homebrew this, but for $30, you get one that's already created, and they've done an amazing job. Very low insertion loss, which is what you want, because you don't want this to suck up some of your potential loss resistance energy we talked about early on in the presentation. Very high power range. Great noise reduction. We talked about this. This is its rejection of other common mode currents that would ordinarily be on your coax. Anything under 20 dB is minus 20 dB is phenomenal. And of course, it's rated for all the bands. It's fantastic. So these two in combination give you about minus 0.46 dB loss, which is really negligible in the whole antenna system. However, being the geek that I am, that's your entry level. Call this your entry level. So for about 60 bucks, you can get your entry level Challenger antenna. But if you want to have the Porsche of antennas, let's call it that way. It used to be called the Cadillac, but you guys don't know it. Porsche of antennas. Palomar makes their own version of the 4-to-1, which is very different technology. And I'll show you. I take these apart, and I got pictures. I'm going to show you. Like I said, I take everything apart, right? I've always done that. My parents hated that, but I still do it. Very low insertion loss, minus 0.424 dB. So over 94% efficient. Covers the 6-meter band beautifully. Palomar then also makes an upgrade to this typical coax wrap toroid. They use a very big bead in here, which I'll show you. Very low insertion loss. Great power. Stronger noise reduction, about another 10 dB of noise reduction, and a very broad bandwidth. So you really have 3 options. You have the entry level, $60, 30 plus 30. You have the Porsche, 70 plus 70, 140. Or what a lot of guys do, because this is the most important component, they take this and they use that. So you have the $100. So you have 60, 100, or 140. So it's your choice. And the Porsche of antennas, in this case, the Challenger, I add a plus to it, right? I add a plus. So this is your Challenger. This is your Challenger Plus. So these are the antennas that I operate. But I know a lot of guys don't want to spend money. So that's why I figured out this particular combination. Same thing with the end-fed half-wave Dominator. Now, here's something. I know a lot of guys, and they're so popular. I've got one at home. End-fed half-wave antennas with a wire. Incredibly popular. There is a big, big downside, though, to a 49-to-1 transformer. And this is the only exception to my efficiency rule, but I wanted to put it in my design just so you folks know it and people use it. When they use it, they know that it's got an issue. The issue is insertion loss. At 4-to-1 gives you about 0.34 dB. This gives you minus 0.96 dB. When you work it out, it's 80% efficient. Most end-fed half-wave antennas with a wire, even though they work really well, they're only 80% efficient. Now, only 80% is much better than a quarter wave with two radials on the ground being 30% efficient. So that's why these antennas are so popular, because the radiation resistance is higher than a quarter wave. And remember, we showed that mathematical exercise. But they're only 80% efficient, but that's okay. It does break one of my rules, but I know that a lot of guys like 49-to-1. The one I spec is from 10 Tennis, handmade by a guy in Tennessee, available on eBay. He does a really good job. You'll never get 6 meters on a 49-to-1. It's just the physics of it. But you match that. That's about 45 bucks on eBay. You match that with the same choke. You lose about a little over a dB, which gives you roughly a little bit less than 80% efficiency. But that's the Dominator, and it will work just fine because it's a half-wave antenna, and you've got a lot more power that's being potentially radiated because you have twice the width. But just like I did with a Challenger, there's a better version. I mentioned that one of my two favorite companies, one is Palomar, the other one is My Antennas. If you ever want to get, and this is what I run at home on our postage stamp lots here in Silicon Valley, I run a 56-to-1 from My Antennas on a sloper, right? It runs from the first story of my house about 10 feet up to a big fiberglass pole in the back about 35 feet up. So it's a nice sloper. It works really well. But here's the reason I run a 56-to-1, especially for My Antennas. Look at the efficiency. It's 91.2% versus 80%. So if you ever want to use an end-fed half-wave antenna, even if you put a wire on it, you can go cheap and get a 49-to-1, or you just basically double the cost and you get a 56-to-1, and you get another 10% of efficiency. I love this thing, and I open it up and I show you the inside. And then you match it with the same higher end choke from Palomar. Together, what is that? 70 plus about 140, or 90 plus 70, about 160 bucks. But you're only losing a half a dB insertion loss between the two. It's phenomenal. Again, just like this combination, you have the $75 version, the 90 plus 30, $120 version, or you have the 90 plus 70, $160. So it's your choice. I use the Challenger Plus and the Dominator Plus, and I love them, but you can do whatever you want. I mean, that's why you homebrew your own antennas. But let's open these things up. Here's the LDG for a mass-produced 4-to-1 UNUN from a very big company. I think they manufacture these somewhere on the East Coast. They use what's called a 140-43 toroid, mix 43. Well, all that really means is, this is code for 140 means it's 1.4 inches from here to there. That's the diameter of the toroid. That's what the 140 means. The inside diameter is 0.9 inches. It's about a ½ inch thick. It's very reasonable. It's very basic. It's not your best possible product, but it works, and it provides a 4-to-1 impedance match of roughly 200 ohms for off-center fed dipole. Look at what Palomar does, though. They say, forget the toroid. Let's use a special, what they call a dual ported bead. They drill 2 holes in a very big bead, 1 1/8 inch high and 1 1/8 inch wide. They drill 2 holes and they wrap. You can't see it because they put all this. I assume this gunk is to help dissipate some of the heat in case it heats up. But they wrap. Instead of wrapping it around a toroid, they wrap it inside this bead, and it gives you a lot better efficiency and a lot better power handling. And it does a beautiful job. Here is, instead of using that coax wrap toroid, here is the higher end, this is the choke. And they use a very similar, very big bead, about 1 1/8 inch high. But they have a hole in the middle, and you can see they wrap. I think it's about 13 turns. 13 turns of wrapping inside, again with the same kind of material, and it gives you much better efficiency, but especially better noise reduction. Let's take a look at the 49-1. This is about as good as you can get. 10 tennis, 49-1, even though it's 80% efficient, is about as good, if not one of the best 49-1 transformers out there on eBay. He hand makes these. He does a really nice job. He has the spacing between the turns just about right. He has a little capacitor there. So he does a good job. It uses a 240-43. So it uses a toroid that's 2.4 inches in diameter with a 1.4-inch inner diameter. And it's, again, like this one, it's about 0.5 inches thick. But let's open up my favorite, the My Antennas. Look at this. It's a piece of geeky beauty. Look at this toroid. Let's compare it. It's 1.4 inches in diameter from here to here, just like this one. But what do you notice? It's got a much smaller inner diameter, 0.6 versus 0.9. So you get more volume right there. But here's the most important thing. This is a ½ inch. This is 1 inch thick. And if you run through, and I know you guys have done this in your math classes, you run through the toroid volume equation. They say on their site it's equivalent, this toroid is equivalent to 3 of these stacked in each other for higher efficiency. I went through the calculations. They're exactly right. It's 3 times the volume. What that gives you is it gives you some more power handling, but most importantly, it gives you better efficiency. The way you increase this from 80% efficiency up to over 90% is through a bigger toroid, a bigger, more volume-full toroid inside of your 56-1. That's why I love this thing so much. Isn't that cool looking? I think that's amazing. But I'm a geek, so I like that kind of stuff. The Challenger Plus, these are the Porsches, using the Palomar 4-1, same counterpoise because it's still a 4-1. But when you go up to a 56-1, you're moving on further on down the radiator, so you're going to have slightly shorter counterpoise wires. But in essence, the principle is the same. They're all tuned to the band because not so much a quarter wave or anything like that, but I've done the modeling and the calculations in the field to determine the appropriate lengths. And they're also linked with spade connectors. And again, you can use a non-conductive insert if you want, instead of just pulling these out. But this is so easy to change. This literally takes me, once I get out the antenna, it takes me single-digit seconds to change the counterpoise and then change the telescoping whip. When I was first testing these in my backyard, I put them on the same, I wouldn't recommend you doing this in general, but I put them on the same tripod. Here's the Dominator with the 56-1. Here's the 4-1 Palomar for the off-center fed, feeding the same telescoping whip. The first time I went to the park, I put out 2 pieces of coax with an AB switch, and depending on who I worked in the country, I would switch back and forth, off-center fed or end-fed half wave, and it was way cool to see the difference depending on. With a Dominator, you get a lower takeoff angle. So guys who were further away said, oh yeah, this sounds louder. Guys who were closer in, because this has a higher takeoff angle, said, oh yeah, this one sounds light. This one sounds louder. So one antenna is not better than the other antenna. It depends on what you're trying to accomplish. If you want global domination, if the bands are open for DX, go with a Dominator. If you want to work continental, go with the off-center fed. If you want to work more regional, go with the quarter wave. They all have their best use case. And of course, because I love to backpack, I created backpack versions. And the nice thing about a half-wave antenna, because there's very little current at the feed point, remember that when I first started, you can have it close to the ground. I use a 16-inch long, wider furniture grade PVC tube. I put it on a spike or a tripod. Here, let's show you the pictures. Here's the Challenger Plus on this PVC tube with a spike. Here's a Dominator Plus. This is here's your feed point, about 2 feet off the ground. That's fine. At least you want at least a foot. You don't never want to put your ununs on the ground, but at least a foot off the ground. I like 2 feet. It works really well. And you can see the counterpoise. It kind of droops down. That's fine. As you get to this point, there's so little current in the counterpoise, you don't have any of that coupling that you had with your high current radial on a quarter wave. And of course, you can also put it, this is a Wolf River coil megapod. You can put it on a tripod if your ground is too rocky or you don't want to put a spike in. And the beauty of this whole thing, it's so small, it's so light. This is my ICOM 705 backpack. It fits right in the side pocket. Notice a little spacer here so I can keep this away from the PVC tube and it kind of goes in the pocket more easily. There's my spike. There's my my whip. I take this up into the hills and wow, do I get lots of QRP contacts with it. It's just amazing. Okay, again, the PDF has all the modeling stats. The bottom line is the structural efficiency of the antenna, not counting the components to match the impedance, over 94%. This is for the Challenger, the off-center fed. Depending on if you use the LDG or use my Palomar, you go from 92 to 94%. So very efficient. SWR on average across all the bands, very low, great reflection coefficient. Now the peak radiation gain on a omnidirectional, this is an omnidirectional antenna, goes from minus 0.67 because it's an off-center fed, it goes up, you've got more metal in the air. It goes to minus 0.27 omnidirectional in all directions. So you get more gain with a half wave, in this case off-center fed. Notice your takeoff angle, your peak radiation angle drops from 24 degrees on the Performer quarter wave to 21 degrees on the off-center fed. So you get a little bit further radiation pattern out because you got a lower angle of radiation takeoff angle. And your beam width drops from about 44 degrees. And as I said, the lower the number, the better. It concentrates more power, like I said, minus 0.27 dBi, into a smaller beam width, 32 degrees. So it's way cool in that regard. Let's go to the Dominator. The Dominator, the same thing. Very high structural efficiency. If you use the 49-to-1, that gets cut down to 80%. If you use the 56-to-1, which I recommend, you get 91%, meeting my criteria. Very low average SWR, very, very good reflection coefficient. Your peak radiation gain, because you're an end-fed half wave instead of an off-center fed, you go from minus 0.27 dBi omnidirectional to plus 0.67 dBi. You get more gain omnidirectional and you get a lower takeoff angle. And my friends, your takeoff angle determines your DX potential if the bands are open. So the Performer was 24, the off-center fed half wave was 21, this is 18. And look, this goes down even further. This is even more concentrated. So that's why this antenna works so well. The model, spits out these beautiful charts and of course all the SWR. This happens to be for 15 meters. But I'm going to switch between the Challenger off-center fed. Keep your eyes here. Keep your eyes here. This is a very typical omnidirectional. It looks very similar to the quarter wave omnidirectional pattern. Watch what happens when I go from an off-center fed half wave to an ed-fed half wave. What do you notice? These lobes get flattened out and they get pushed forward. So you're pushing more energy at a lower takeoff angle for greater DX potential and a much tighter beam width. These speak for themselves. This is the real world. Those are the model. This is the real world. Not only do you get amazing SWR, look at how broad-banded this antenna is. This is the Challenger. The off-center fed half wave, the entire 20-meter band is 1.1 or better. Flat, 17 meters. The entire 15-meter band, 1.1 or better. Remember, we're talking efficiency with very, very little return current back to the transmitter. Completely flat on 12 meters because that's a small band. Look at the 10-meter band. You don't have to, you can go from, here's your CW, here's your digital, here's typical technician sideband, and here's FM up here right around, 28,600-ish, somewhere around there. You can go, you don't even have to change the antenna, the telescoping whip. It's so broad banded, you can operate any mode on the entire band. And of course, here's the very broad 6-meter band, extremely flat. This is the off-center fed Challenger using a 25-foot whip. If you use a 17-foot whip, you can't get 20 meters. It's just not long enough. But you can get 17 through 6. That's not bad. You can use your 17-foot whip and get 17 through 6 on this off-center fed half wave. Let's go to the Dominator. Because the Dominator is further on down, it requires a longer radiator. There's no way you'll get 17 or 20 meters on this. But look how flat it is on 17. 15, 12 meters, and 10 meters. And if you have a 17-foot whip, you only get 10 and 12. But let me tell you, at the peak of the cycle where we are now, that's where a lot of the DX is. I mean, 15 has got great DX, but a lot of the DX, especially 10 meters, is amazing when the conditions are right. Okay, let me summarize a little bit. We're coming down to the wire here, and it's 20. Oh, it's 20 to 9. I got to wrap up. Here's the performer. The most important things I want you to notice is the omnidirectional peak radiation gain, minus 0.67 on the quarter wave, minus 0.27 on the off-center fed half wave, plus 0.67 on the end-fed half wave. The takeoff angle, peak radiation, the lower for better DX, 24 on the performer, minus 3, 21 on the challenger, minus 3, 18 on the dominator. The beam width even tighter from 46 to 32 to 28. Just to give you a pictorial, here's the performer. This is the takeoff angle. Here's the beam width. This is the performer. There's the challenger. There's a dominator. You can see why this one with a lower takeoff angle and more radiated power gets you some fantastic DX. Overlay the three radiation curves. Let's zoom in. At the radiated gain at 18 degrees off the horizon on the dominator, you get that strong gain, the challenger minus 0.32, the performer minus 0.1. But notice the performer, even the performer, because of the extra gain off the higher end of the lobe, the performer in this omnidirectional configuration outperforms the other two antennas up here. But you don't want to use these antennas if you just want to be up here in regional because they're just too low angle for that. Let's put the performer in its 90-degree radial pattern and look what happens. The performer in its 90 and this is why it's so popular for POTA. It's a great regional antenna. The performer exceeds the challenger at 16 degrees off the horizon, and it exceeds the dominator at 23 degrees off the horizon. You get all this extra energy regional, and of course you get a little bit of NVIS. And this is why this antenna is such a popular regional antenna. And there's a summary of the three. They all have high efficiency, fast to deploy, easy to pack and support, my three design criteria. Performer gets you 40, the others don't. The Dominator gives you the best antenna for global coverage. The Performer is the best regional. And the Challenger off-center fed is kind of in between. It's also my highest radiation efficiency if you're using the Palomar 4:1, 94%. And you also get 20 meters and 6 meters with this one that you won't with a Dominator end-fed half wave. And I want to give you one little tease as we close here in the next 2 minutes. I love beam antennas, but you know, they're not too portable for HF. But I figured out how to take my Dominator end-fed half-wave antenna and put on a parasitic director to make a 2-element vertical beam for 17 to 10 meters. A 2-element vertical beam. And I'll tell you a story. I was at this park. It was this particular day. I was at this park and I put this together, and you get about 4 dB forward gain at a very low takeoff angle. So very DX oriented, right? You wouldn't use this antenna if you're working the, most of the US, but it's very DX oriented. I pointed this, and I'll show you, and in my PDF, I show you how to build this PVC support structure. And this is called a parasitic director, which means it's an element in front of your radiator. A parasitic means you don't have to put any coax. It's just a piece of floating metal, if you will, on a non-conductive structure that's in front at the same level of your radiator, and it's typically about 6% shorter. And this is for 10 meters. As you go to different bands, what happens is you go lower in frequency, you got to increase your radiator length, increase your parasitic director length, and you also have to increase the distance between the two elements. But this particular design helps you do that. But the one story I wanted to mention is in California, on this day, I rotated this structure, so I was going north over the pole. I worked a park in Germany. He gave me 5.7. 5.7. That means 5 means very, very clear, understandable, and 7 means 7 on your S meter. He gave me a 5.7 in Germany, and he was at a park, and I was in California. It also helps on receive. I picked him up about a 5.3, 5.4. But this thing is amazing. Here's a close-up of it. The way I kind of engineered it, again, with this is more mechanical engineering now, with and I took that course too when I got my double E. It's kind of fun. Is I put what I call a trombone. I put a smaller PVC tube inside of a bigger one. And so, for example, I mark, you probably can't see it on the big screen. Maybe you guys looking at your computer screens can see it. I put a little mark on the inner tube and I say, okay, that's your spacing for 10 meters between the two. If you want to go to 12 meters, you pull this out a little bit more, roughly to there, 15 meters to there, and 17 to there. And here's a better angle of it. So I show you how to build in the PDF this particular PVC structure. There's your radiator. This is basically the Dominator antenna. You only can use this with a Dominator. Here's your counterpoise wire, and here's your PVC structure. It's very portable. This two-element vertical beam is basically the two whips, your tripod already, basically this is your Dominator with two whips. It all fits in this 36-inch photography bag. And then I designed the PVC structure so that it's all glued except in a couple spots. So it comes apart flat. So you can store it flat or you can throw it in your car flat and it's all set to go. This is your horizontal piece. This is your vertical piece. So this end goes on to there. You can see the coupling nut for the parasitic director and here's the base. But look at the computer model. Look what it does when you have a parasitic director, a second element in front of the radiator. Look how strong this is. This is crazy. In fact, on 10 meters that day that I worked Germany, park to park, I was getting a 4 dB gain. 4 dB. In other words, you put in 100 watts, you're getting close to 200 watts out the front of the antenna in the direction of the parasitic director at a very low angle of radiation, 16 degrees. Very high efficiency. If you're using the 56-to-1, you're going to get 94% efficiency or 92%. It's fantastic. Again, real world, extremely broadbanded. 17 meters, 15 meters, 12 meters, 10 meters. Look at the 10-meter band, this massively wide band. It's basically 1.2 to 1 to better. You're only losing about 0.8% of your power down the coax being reflected back to the transmitter. Very, very good. So all I did is I just added this one more column on there. You can see here's the regular one element, 0.67 dBi versus average across all the bands, 3.6 dBi. 18 degrees, drop another 2 degrees for lower angle, takeoff angle, and you're concentrating your beam width from 28 even tighter to 24. Is one antenna better than the other? No. It depends on what you want to use them for. Regional, continental, use the Performer. Continental, global, use the Challenger. Global, the Dominator. You want to go crazy global? Dominator 2-element beam. So as I mentioned, and that's the end. I know it's late. You guys have work to do. These are all the PDF links. I think Aiden may have shared these. If he hasn't, then he will. My email is good on QRZ. If you know QRZ.com, my email is good there. I answer over a couple cups of Italian roast coffee every morning, every email that comes in overnight. I answer them within 24 hours. Not only build questions, theoretical questions, but if you just want to show off your build, send me pictures. I love seeing those. These are always going to be free. That's what we do. When you don't have to go out there and earn money anymore, you can just share your knowledge with the rest of the community, and I like to do that. Of course, I accept donations, but very, very optional. Okay, let me stop because I know it's late for you guys. All right. Any more questions? Did I wipe out your brains?
We have one.
I saw the guy walking up. Go ahead.
You know what power you were running when you made that contact into Germany by chance?
100 watts. 100 watts.
That's not bad.
Over the pole. That's impressive.
Yeah, it was 100 watts. Now, I will say this. I could have done it. I think I could have done it QRP. I would not have gotten a 5.7, but the conditions were good over the pole that day. So you have to have the right conditions. I'm not going to say it's a miracle antenna. Nothing is a miracle, but the conditions were right. I think I could have gotten him with QRP. It would have been a lot tougher because I'd be running 9 watts versus 90 watts, but with a 4 dB gain. So you never know. I could have gotten it, but I have gotten DX with my QRP setup. And I wouldn't say the two-element beam is a backpackable. I've never done that. But the Dominator with a 56 to 1 with that great omnidirectional gain, I've taken QRP and have made great contacts across the country. Easy. Easy. QRP. Good question. Any more?
Well, thank you.
Okay.
Doesn't look like we have any more.
I do have a question.
Of course he does.
Yeah.
Here he
yeah.
comes. He's walking up. Hello again.
Hey, so
Hey.
so our shack is located at the top of our engineering building, which it's kind of an unusual location to be setting up antennas. It's on the 11th story of a building.
Oh.
Yeah, so it's
Ooh.
like kind of a skyscraper. I guess it's the tallest building in Morgantown where we are, but
Ooh.
that building has a metal roof and we have like limited area to work with. So kind of a hotly debated topic amongst students in our club is how does this metal roof impact antennas that we put up there?
We believe it's
so-
grounded.
Yeah, like it's basically a giant sheet of metal with, asphalt shingling over it is the roof of the building. So
Basically, it's a flat elevated radial.
Yeah, essentially. So some people think like if we grounded into that, it would improve our antenna performance if we did verticals. Other people think that like it will degrade if we put like a dipole or something up, it'll degrade the performance. What do you think would be like the most optimal
All of the
configuration?
above is correct. So
Yeah.
when you got, no, I'm serious. So when you've got a quarter wave antenna, think of your metal roof as one giant elevated Faraday cloth, right? One giant elevated flat radial. If I have that, I would put up a quarter wave antenna and attach the ground side of the antenna, or the coax in this case, to that metal roof. It would be amazing because as long as the metal roof isn't coupled to the ground down below, hopefully it's not. I doubt it is, but they
I
may
mean,
have lightning arrest.
eventually it is connected, but through like 140 feet of steel of the building, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's not a great ground, but it's not
Okay.
totally
Well,
disconnected
but
either.
you don't,
Yeah.
it's not totally disconnected. But in this, ironically, you don't want it to be connected to ground, right? Because what
Oh.
happens? You know that capacitive coupling happens. But the fact that it's so far away without even being there, one of the things you learn is that you got to come up with a theory in your head. And you say, okay, my theory in my head is that this flat metal roof could be a great counterpoise, elevated counterpoise, call it an elevated radial. It's the same thing. Uh, and I think I can put in a quarter wave antenna on it, and I bet you I can tune up on all the bands by adjusting the radiator, which would be a pain to go up on the roof to do. But let's say you had some kind of what are those antennas called? Those ATOS antennas where you could remotely change it, but I don't like those because of the coil. But let's suppose that
Like
you
the
you could
screwdriver
adjust.
ones,
What's that?
like the screwdriver antennas.
Yeah, screwdriver.
Yeah.
I mean, those are convenient, but I don't like them because the coil's got a lot of
Uh-huh.
insertion loss and you lose efficiency. But let's suppose you didn't have that. Let's suppose you just had a regular whip and some crazy guy says, let's operate on 20 meters all the time. Great. You just keep it at 20 meters. And once in a while, you may adjust it for 10, go up there and change it. But let's keep it on one band. If I had to pick one band, I'd pick 20. It's open all the time.
Yeah.
But that would be my theory without seeing the building, without being there. But then I would say, all right, let's just try it. Let's put an antenna up on the metal roof. Make sure that the radiator is isolated from the counterpoise or the big flat radial in this case. Make sure the feed point's at least about a foot away from it because it is a counterpoise. It is like an elevated radial. And see what happens. Start taking some SWR measurements. In essence, that is an elevated quarter wave antenna. Let me tell you my first antenna when I was about your age, actually, probably. Well, I'm a little older, about 22, 23 years old. My first house that I got out of college to California, and I still have my geeky ham radio license. And I had a house that I rented, and I took a big, what they call a multiband butternut. You may have heard of that antenna. It's a kind of an old school antenna now, but a butternut multiband antenna. I put it on the peak of my roof because my dad told me go with an elevated quarter wave. So I put that butternut antenna on the peak of my roof. Now that's a comp roof, right? Composition shingles, not a metal roof. But I put it on top of that, and then I put down two radials down the slope of the roof, two for each band. You got to have two radials per band when you elevate, right? Two radials per band when you elevate. Now with a completely metal roof, you don't have that option. But that antenna worked so good because it was an elevated quarter wave antenna with elevated radials. Even though they're on the comp roof, yeah, there's some interference there. There's some wires in the attic and that sort of thing. But for the most part, that thing works so well. So my advice is if you haven't tried it, try it. Now, the downside is that metal roof isn't tunable, right? Because on my antenna, you can tune the radials. It's the other half of the antenna. But I'd give it a try.
Mhm.
Just, but now to answer the other question, the guy that said if we put a dipole up there, would it interfere? Yeah. Yeah. A half wave antenna does not like for example, I tried one time when it's really rainy in California and I don't want to activate it at a picnic table, I just use my car and I use a tram triple magnet mount on top of my car. It's great for quarter wave because the car body acts as your elevated radial, much like your tin roof is. It's insulated from the ground because of the four tires. But for fun, I thought I'd put up a half wave on my car roof to see what would happen, really mainly for 10 meters. It didn't like it. The metal underneath the half wave antenna completely probably had some weird, bizarre reflections. Who knows what else it did? It did not like it at all. I couldn't get it to resonate well. It barely radiated. So a half wave antenna on that roof won't work. A quarter wave vertical, yeah, it has a really good potential to work.
Okay. And then our other concern that is part of the reason we haven't really experimented with verticals on HF is vertically polarized interference.
Mm,
It's we have a lot of interference in Morgantown, so
yeah. Silicon Valley, same.
yeah. But I guess we'll kind of just have to try it.
Yeah, try it out. But again, you can do a lot of things, in particular with a really good high quality choke. That helps reduce some of the noise, even though it is vertically polarized. It does reduce some of the noise. And the higher up you go with your vertical antenna in elevation, the better chances you are to suppress some of that noise. But it's just like I said earlier, you can think about it, but then you got to do it because it's just like in my case, I model it in the virtual world, then I put it in my backyard and bingo, it goes, wow, it works better than I expected, or gee, it's not as good as I expected. I have to make some changes. Everything affects everything when it comes to an antenna. So until you try it, you just don't know.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anything else I can do to help out you guys? You guys are the future of ham radio. So I want you guys to be successful. So anything I can do, either in this presentation or through email, I'm happy to help. Really happy to help. Anything else, Aiden?
Doesn't look like it.
I know it's
I don't
9
have
o'clock out
anything.
there. I know it's 9 o'clock. Sorry about that, but that was 2 hours. Well, you guys asked a lot of good questions. What can I say?